but 5 are often listed. The New York Restraining Act of 1767 passed on 5 June 1767. The Revenue Act of 1767 passed on 26 June 1767. The Indemnity Act 1767 passed on 29 June 1767. The Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767 passed on 29 June of 1767, and the Vice Admiralty Court Act of 1768 passed on 6 July 1768. The purpose of the acts were to, 1, raise revenue in the colonies to pay the salaries of governors and judges so that they would remain loyal to Great Britain. We had that problem with William, all the way back to William the Conqueror, right? When the judges were more amenable to the king rather than to the law, we had a problem. 2, create more effective means of enforcing compliance with trade regulations. 3, punish the province of New York for failing to comply with the 1765 Quartering Act. 4, establish the precedent that the British Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. The Townshend Act met stiff resistance in the colonies, and public opposition to them was widely debated in colonial newspapers. Opponents of the acts gradually became violent, leading to the Boston Massacre of 1770. The acts placed an indirect tax on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea, all of which had to be imported from Britain. This form of revenue generation was Townshend's response to the failure of the Stamp Act of 1765, which had provided the first form of direct taxation placed upon the colonies. However, the import duties proved to be similarly controversial. Colonial indignation over the acts was expressed in John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts' circular letter. Hamilton, one of the greatest writings of Hamilton, and I'm not a big fan of Hamilton. Hamilton wrote a piece at the age of 19 called The Farmer's, let me think of what the name of it is. The Farmer's Letter, I have to think about it. It's called The Farmer's Letter, but anyway, it's a counter to that letter from the farmer, and it's absolutely masterful. At 19, we brag about we were so smart. There isn't a PhD in America that could hold a candle to that particular document. There was widespread protest, and American port cities refused to import British goods, so Parliament began to partially repeal the Townshend duties. So you see again, they put this new tax on, they put these new duties on, and it wasn't working well, and the people were pushing back, and they had to start repealing them. What do you think they looked like in Britain? What do you think the people's representatives in the House of Commons and the House of Lords looked like? They were looking weak too, and the king was looking weak. And that's not good, to look weak in Britain. In March of 1770, most of the taxes from the Townshend Act were repealed by Parliament under Frederick Lord North. However, the import duty on tea was retained in order to demonstrate to the colonists that Parliament held the sovereign authority to tax its colonies, in accordance with the Declaratory Act of 1766. The British government continued to tax the American colonies without providing representation in Parliament. American resentment, corrupt British officials, and abusive enforcement spurred colonial attacks on British ships, including the burning of the Gaspee in 1772. The Townshend Act taxation of imported tea was enforced once again by the Tea Act of 1773, and this led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, in which Bostonians destroyed a large shipment of taxed tea. Parliament responded with severe punishments in the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The 13 colonies drilled their militia units, and war finally erupted in Lexington on Concord in April of 1775, launching the American Revolution, or basically the American Civil War that turned into the American Revolution on July 2nd, 1776. The Boston Massacre of 1770. The Boston Massacre, known in Great Britain as the Incident on King Street. And that's what's taught in their schools today, is the Incident on King Street. It's not called the Boston Massacre there. It's the Incident on King Street. Was a confrontation in Boston on March 5th, 1770, in which a group of 9 British soldiers shot 5 people out of a crowd of 300 or 400 who were harassing them verbally and throwing various projectiles. The event was heavily publicized as a massacre by leading patriots such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. British troops had been stationed in the province of Massachusetts Bay since 1768 in order to support Crown-appointed officials and to enforce unpopular parliamentary legislation. On the evening of March 5th, Private Hugh White stood on guard duty outside the Boston Customs House on King Street, today known as State Street. A wigmaker's apprentice, approximately 13 years old, named Edward Garrick, called out to Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch, accusing him of refusing to pay a bill due to Garrick's master. Goldfinch had settled the account the previous day and ignored the insult. Private White called out to Garrick that he should be more respectful of the officer, and the 2 men exchanged insults. Garrick then started poking Goldfinch in the chest with his finger. White left his post, challenged the boy, and struck him on the side of the head with his musket. Garrick cried out in pain, and his companion, Bartholomew Broaders, began to argue with White, which attracted a large crowd. Henry Knox was a 19-year-old bookseller who later served as a general in the Revolution. He came upon the scene and warned White that, quote, if he fired, he must die for it. As the evening progressed, the crowd around Private White grew larger and more boisterous. Church bells were rung, which usually signified a fire, bringing more people out. More than 50 Bostonians pressed around White, led by a mixed-race former slave named Crispus Attucks. He was the first one to die. Throwing objects at the sentry and challenging him to fire his weapon, White had taken up a somewhat safer position on the steps of the customs house, and he sought assistance. Runners alerted Captain Thomas Preston, the officer of the watch at the nearby barracks. According to his report, Preston dispatched a non-commissioned officer and 6 privates from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment of the Foot of Regiment, is supposed to be on foot, to relieve White with fixed bayonets. The soldiers were Corporal William Wems and Privates Hugh Montgomery, John Carroll, William Macaulay, William Warren, and Matthew Kilroy, accompanied by Preston. They pushed their way through the crowd. Henry Knox took Preston by the coat and told him, for God's sakes, take care of your men. If they fire, you must die. Captain Preston responded, I am aware of it. When they reached Private White on the custom house stairs, the soldiers loaded their muskets and arrayed themselves in a semicircular formation. Preston shouted at the crowd, estimated between 300 and 400, to disperse. The crowd continued to press around the soldiers, taunting them by yelling fire, by spitting at them, and by throwing snowballs and other small objects. Innkeeper Richard Palms was carrying a cudgel, and he came up to Preston and asked if the soldiers' weapons were loaded. Preston assured him that they were, but they would not fire unless he ordered it. He later stated in his deposition that he was unlikely to do so, since he was standing in front of them. A thrown object then struck Private Montgomery, knocking him down and causing him to drop his musket. He recovered his weapon and angrily shouted, "Damn you, fire!" then discharged it into the crowd. Although no command was given, Palms swung his cudgel first at Montgomery, hitting his arm, and then at Preston. He narrowly missed Preston's head, striking him on the arm instead. There was a pause of uncertain length. Eyewitnesses estimate ranged from several seconds to 2 minutes, after which the soldiers fired into the crowd. It was not a disciplined volley, since Preston gave no orders to fire. The soldiers fired a ragged series of shots which hit 11 men. 3 Americans died instantly. Rope maker Samuel Gray James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice ivory turner, was struck by a ricocheting musket ball at the back of the crowd and died early the next morning. Irish immigrant Patrick Carr was shot in the abdomen, an inevitably fatal wound at that time, and died 2 weeks later. Apprentice Christopher Monk was seriously wounded. He was crippled and died in 1780, purportedly due to the injuries that he had sustained in the attack a decade earlier. The crowd moved away from the immediate area of the custom house, but continued to grow in nearby streets. Captain Preston immediately called out most of the 29th Regiment, which adopted defensive positions in front of the State House. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson was summoned to the scene and was forced by the movement of the crowd into the council chamber of the State House. From its balcony, he was able to minimally restore order, promising that there would be a fair inquiry into the shootings if the crowd dispersed. Does anybody know who defended the British soldiers? See, a lot of that history I read to you came from depositions and came from the court hearing. There was a court hearing. John Adams was their lawyer. A lot of people were very angry at him for defending them, but he said everyone has the right to a fair trial. It wasn't that he was on their side, he just believed in the law that everyone had the right to a fair trial. Committees of Correspondence of 1772. The Committees of Correspondence were, prior to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, a collection of American political organizations that sought to coordinate opposition to British Parliament and later support for American independence. The brainchild of Samuel Adams, a patriot from Boston, the committee sought to establish through the writing of letters an underground network of communication among patriot leaders in the 13 colonies. The committees were instrumental in setting up the first colonial Congress, which met in Philadelphia. The function of the committees was to alert the residents of a given colony of the actions taken by the British Crown. Do you understand why one of the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment is what? The right to free press. Why do you think that was so important to them? Because of the free press. If it hadn't been for that committee on Committee of Correspondence, all of our founding fathers and the patriots would not have known what was going on from colony to colony, from place to place. It was extremely important to keep the people informed of what was going on. The news was, some information from the function of the committees was to alert the residents of a given colony of the actions taken by the British Crown and to disseminate information from cities to the countryside. The news was typically spread via handwritten letters or printed pamphlets, which would be carried by couriers on horseback or aboard ships. The committees were responsible for ensuring that this news accurately reflected the views and was dispatched to the proper receiving groups. Boy, if only our journalists would read that today, huh? Many correspondents were members of colonial legislative assemblies, and others were also active in the Sons of Liberty and Stamp Act Congress. A total of about 7,000 to 8,000 patriots served on these committees at the colonial and local levels, comprising most of the leadership in their communities. Loyalists were naturally excluded. The committees became, the Loyalists were the Tories. The committees became the leaders of the American resistance to Great Britain and largely determined the war effort at the state and local level. When Congress decided to boycott British products, the colonial and local committees took charge, examining merchant records and publishing the names of merchants who attempted to defy the boycott. The committees promoted patriotism and home manufacturing, advising Americans to avoid luxuries and lead a more simple life. The committees gradually extended their power over many aspects of American public life. They set up espionage networks to identify disloyal elements, displaced royal officials, and helped diminish the influence of British government in each of the colonies. In late 1774 and early 1775, they supervised the elections of provincial conventions, which began the operation of a true colonial government. The Boston Tea Party of 1773. The Boston Tea Party was an American political and mercantile protest by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts on December 16th of 1773. The target was the Tea Act of May 10th of 1773, which allowed the British East Indies Company to sell tea from China and American colonies without paying taxes apart from those imposed by the Townshend Acts. The Sons of Liberty strongly opposed the taxes in the Townshend Act as a violation of their rights. Protesters, some disguised as American Indians, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the East India Company. The demonstrators boarded the ship and threw the chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. The British government considered the protest an act of treason and responded harshly. The episode escalated into the American Revolution, becoming an iconic event of American history. Since then, other political protests, such as the Tea Party movement, have referred to themselves as historical successors to the Boston protest of 1773. Now, it was the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were also collecting the weapons. The Sons of Liberty were headed up by Samuel Adams. They would listen to Samuel Adams, but the fact of the matter is the Sons of Liberty were a group of extremely violent thugs, but they would listen to Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams could control them. And they were the ones collecting the guns. They were the ones preparing for ultimately what would come. And this is why the Sons of Liberty were hunted down for acts of treason. They were looking at them as traitors. And what happens with traitors? What's the penalty for traitors? Death. And that's what they were after. And so they were, because they were coming after them harshly, that's part of this problem where they started pushing against the guns and trying to take the guns. The Tea Party was the culmination of a resistance movement throughout British America against the Tea Act, a tax passed by the British Parliament in 1773. Colonists objected to the Tea Act, believing it violated their rights as Englishmen to, quote, no taxation without representation, unquote. That is, to be taxed only by their own elected representatives and not by a parliament in which they were not represented. In addition, the well-connected East India Company had been granted competitive advantages over colonial tea importers who resented the move and feared additional infringement on their business. Protesters had prevented the unloading of tea in 3 other colonies, but in Boston, embattled Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea to be returned to Great Britain. So this wasn't just happening in Boston. It was happening all up and down the seacoast. Now this is a problem when government gets involved and decides to pick winners and losers in business, isn't it? This is part of what the problem is. You think our founding fathers understood that? When we get to the bounty payments for cod fisheries debates in 1792, you're going to hear that very sentiment echoed by Madison. The Boston Tea Party was a significant event in the growth of the American Revolution. Parliament responded in 1774 with the Intolerable Acts, or Coercive Acts, which among other provisions ended local self-government in Massachusetts and closed Boston's commerce. Colonists up and down the 13 colonies in turn responded to the Intolerable Acts with additional acts of protest and by convening the First Continental Congress, which petitioned the British monarch for repeal of the acts and coordinated colonial resistance to them. The crisis escalated and the American Revolution War began near Boston in 1775. Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts of 1774. The Intolerable Acts were a series of punitive laws passed by the British Parliament in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. The laws aimed to punish Massachusetts colonists for their defiance in the Tea Party protest of the Tea Act. In Great Britain, these laws were referred to as the Coercive Acts. They were a key development leading to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in April of 1775. 4 acts were enacted by Parliament in early 1774 in direct response to the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Boston Port, Massachusetts government impartial administration of justice and quartering acts. The acts took away self-governance and rights that Massachusetts had enjoyed since its founding, triggering outrage and indignation in the 13 colonies. The British Parliament hoped these punitive measures would, by making an example of Massachusetts, reverse the trend of colonial resistance to the parliamentary authority that had begun with the 1764 Sugar Act. A fifth act, the Quebec Act, enlarged the boundaries of what was then the province of Quebec, notably southwestern into the Ohio country and other further Midwestern states, and instituted reforms generally favorable to the Francophone Catholic inhabitants of the region. Although unrelated to the other four acts, it was passed in the same legislative session and seen by the colonists as one of the intolerable acts. The Patriots viewed the acts as an arbitrary violation of the rights of Massachusetts, and in September of 1774, they organized the First Continental Congress to coordinate a protest. As tensions escalated, the Revolutionary War broke out in April of 1775, leading to the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in July of 1776. The First Continental Congress of 1774. The First Continental Congress was a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 British colonies that began the United States. It met from September 5th to October 26th of 1774 at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, after the British Navy instituted a blockade of Boston Harbor, and Parliament passed the Punitive Intolerable Acts in response to the December 1773 Boston Tea Party. During the opening weeks of the Congress, the delegates conducted a spirited discussion about how the colonies could collectively respond to the British government's coercive actions, and they worked to make a common cause. As a prelude to its decisions, the Congress's first action was the adoption of the Suffolk Resolves, a measure drawn up by several counties in Massachusetts that included a declaration of grievances, called for a trade boycott of British goods, and urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. A less radical plan was then proposed to create a union of Great Britain and the colonies, but the delegates tabled the measure and later struck it from the record of their proceedings. They then agreed on a declaration of resolves that included the Continental Association, a proposal for an embargo on British trade. They also drew up a petition to the king pleading for redress of their grievances and repeal of the Intolerable Acts. That appeal had no effect, so the colonies convened the Second Continental Congress the following May, shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, to organize the defense of the colonies at the outset of the Revolutionary War. The American Revolutionary War, 1775. Remember, it started out a civil war. Despite attempts to achieve a peaceful solution, fighting began after the Westminster Massacre in March. At the Battle of Lexington on April 19, 1775, the shot heard round the world, and in June, Congress authorized the creation of a Continental Army with George Washington as commander-in-chief. Although the coercion policy advocated by the North Ministry was opposed by a faction within Parliament, both sides increasingly viewed conflict as inevitable. The Olive Branch petition sent by Congress to George III in July of 1775 was rejected, and in August, Parliament declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. Following the loss of Boston in March of 1776, Sir William Howe, the new British commander-in-chief, launched the New York and New Jersey campaign. He captured New York City in November before Washington won small but significant victories at Trenton and Princeton, which restored Patriot confidence. In the summer of 1777, Howe succeeded in taking Philadelphia, but in October, a separate force under John Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga. This victory was crucial in convincing powers like France and Spain that an independent United States was a viable entity. The Continental Army then went into winter quarters in Valley Forge, where General von Steuben drilled it into an organized fighting unit. Today, we've got a little thing in, when I was a drill sergeant in the Army, we had FM 75-5, which is known as the Drill Sergeant's Bible. In there, there's a little thing called the Steuben's Blue Book. That was from Lord Steuben. That the military customs and courtesies that we still practice today in the military comes from that. France provided the U.S. informal economic and military support from the beginning of the rebellion, and after Saratoga, the two countries signed a commercial agreement and a treaty of alliance in February of 1778. In return for a guarantee of independence, Congress joined France in its global war with Britain and agreed to defend the French West Indies. Spain also allied with France against Britain in the Treaty of Aranjuez, 1779, though it did not formally ally with the Americans. Nevertheless, access to ports in Spanish Louisiana allowed the Patriots to import arms and supplies, while the Spanish Gulf Coast campaign deprived the Royal Navy of key bases in the South. This undermined this, and that becomes important when we start listening to Patrick Henry's, Thomas Paine's letter on the crisis. He explains how the British Army attacked the middle of the colonies, not to the north, not to the south, because they were trying to get the Tories, the British loyalists, on their side to help fight this war. And they did, for the most part, that did work, but when they did their southern invasion, when they finally pushed and went into the south, and the Tories that were supporting the British Army were abused, they welcomed them in. They would come into their farmhouses, they would eat all their food, they would rape their wives and children, and they would kill the men and burn the farm down. A lot of the Tories started to change. That's what changed that 7% that wanted to fight for independence to a 12% base, a very strong minority. It wasn't a majority that fought for independence in this country. It was a very dedicated minority. This undermined the 1778 strategy devised by Howe's replacement, Sir Henry Clinton, which took the war into the southern United States. Despite some initial success, by September of 1781, Cornwallis was besieged by a Franco-American force in Yorktown. After an attempt to resupply the garrison failed, Cornwallis surrendered in October. Although the British wars with France and Spain continued for another 2 years, Britain's forces in America were generally confined to several harbors and western forts, while fighting in the North America largely ceased. In April 1782, the North Ministry was replaced by a new British government which accepted American independence and began negotiating the Treaty of Paris. With the treaty's ratification on September 3rd of 1783, Britain accepted American independence and the war officially ended. The treaties of Versailles resolved separate conflicts with France and Spain. The Lee Resolution of July 2nd, 1776. The Lee Resolution, also known as the Resolution for Independence, was the formal assertion passed by the Second Colonial Congress on July 2nd, 1776, which resolved that the 13 colonies in America, at the time referred to as United Colonies, were, quote, free and independent states, unquote, separated from the British Empire and creating what became the United States of America, USA. News of this act was published that evening in the Pennsylvania Evening Post and the next day in the Pennsylvania Gazette. The Declaration of Independence is the formal document which officially announced and explained the resolution approved 2 days later on July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was declaring to a candid world why the United States was sovereign and independent of Britain. But the birth certificate for America was the Lee Resolution of July 2nd, 1776. The resolution is named for Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who proposed it to Congress after receiving instructions and wording from the 5th Virginia Convention and its president, Edmund Pendleton. Lee's full resolution had 3 parts, which were considered by Congress on June 7, 1776. Along with the independence issue, it also proposed to establish a plan for ensuring American foreign relations and to prepare a plan of confederation for the states to consider. Congress decided to address each of these 3 parts separately. Some sources indicate that Lee used the language from the Virginia Convention's instructions almost verbatim. Voting was delayed for several weeks on the first part of the resolution, while state support of the legislative instruction for independence were consolidated, but the press of